Hey everyone, how are we all doing? This is Some Christian Guy. Find me on Facebook, oneway.com/media, and you find me on YouTube as well. Just go to all those places, type in Some Christian Guy, and you will find me. Now, today I want to be talking about natural theology and why I was wrong concerning the particular field of natural theology. Now, this is not the sort of thing where I'm going to be saying that natural theology is wrong. That's not my position, but I'm going to rather discuss about its proper place within a philosophical framework, right? And how it sort of works in the world today, because it's become very popular. And everyone is going completely nuts for apologetics, and the vast majority of Christian apologetics today is basically natural theology, right? And it comes down from a whole long tradition. And I'm going to discuss about, when I say I was wrong about it, wrong about its place in the whole philosophical discussion between the Christian and the atheist specifically. Those have been the most dramatic cases. So without further ado, here's my board. Again, people do better with visuals, and it sort of helps keep me on track of what I'm doing. So, what is natural theology essentially? Basically, what natural theology does is it looks at, so this is my, I'm not very good, so this is my little picture of the earth, right? So people, what they'll do is they'll look at the natural world, right? This is what natural theology is essentially. Looks at the natural world and, essentially speaking, reverse engineers what they see in the world, right? In order to reason upwards to God, right? So a lot of people, I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say that nature is the other book of the Bible, right? And yes and no is basically the answer to that, right? Yes, it is, but there is a caveat, right? So natural theology as a tradition, right, as a philosophical tradition, does not originate with Christianity, and a lot of people need to understand this. And this is what a lot of people, especially Protestants, do not understand, right? We've inherited this, and we thought, wow, brilliant, this is the way we go. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is natural theology comes down to us from Hellenistic Greek philosophy. So when we're doing natural theology, in a lot of instances, the reasons why we go wrong, when we do go wrong, and so on and so forth, and the reason why it doesn't work very successfully when in debating atheists, is because both the Christian doing natural theology and the atheist are doing the exact same thing, right? They're using the same philosophical categories that Aristotle and them were using, right? And Plato and all of these guys were using. And so you've got, and I've watched so many debates, right? Richard Dawkins versus whoever, right? Some apologist, Lawrence Krauss versus William Craig, John Lennox versus Hitchens, or whoever the case might be, right? And so what you generally find is they've got they come up with all of the classical arguments, right? So the argument from contingency, and the argument to the first cause, or the Kalam cosmological argument, where everything that begins has a cause, and so on and so forth. And all of these things reverse engineer. Basically, we're looking at the world, right? And we are reverse engineering back up to a God. Now, here's the problem, right? When you do that, like take the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, right? As an argument for God. Now, most people would say that this is not a knockdown proof or anything like that, but it forms part of a cumulative case for God. And here's what we're getting at. So in its own right, it's not necessarily wrong, but it's obviously incomplete, right? Because you reason back and say everything that begins has a cause. The universe began, therefore the universe has a cause. Now that's perfectly logical and no one disagrees with that, right? Especially since everyone became convinced of the Big Bang. Now before the Big Bang, you could not get people to agree to that syllogism, right? Because a lot of people before the Big Bang evidence, as it were, came in and forced even atheists to agree, all right, the universe have the beginning. It's very irritating that the Christians got it right, because the other religions don't believe in that, right? And the only reason why Islam per se does is because, well, that's their cultural milieu. Islam is plagiarized Judeo-Christianity, basically, right? Coupled with and thrown in monism and all that sort of thing, right? They've got the monad deity. It's awful. Anyway, so now here's the problem. When you do this, so nowadays everyone will agree with that, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe have the cause. No one disagrees. But then from there, Christians don't think it's a quantum leap, so therefore the cause was God, right? And so the atheist sits back and is like, well, hang on. Therefore the universe has a cause. Yeah, right, we can agree with that. But why do you just jump from there to God, right? And the reason for that is because the Christian presupposes the existence of God. And this is where what we call presuppositionalism, or the transcendental arguments, actually come in. And the transcendental argument should precede natural theology, right? You cannot go to an atheist and just start talking natural theology. Ridiculous. Because the fact of the matter is, the atheist has his presuppositions and you have your presuppositions, and whether you like it or not, every single person on the planet has presuppositions, things that they just accept for granted, that's true, right? And that's what presuppositionalism is. The reason why it took me so long to get to it is because I thought, well, presuppositionalism is idiotic, because how can you just presuppose? It's like an a priori fallacy. You just assume something is true and therefore it's true, right? And this is what exactly what a lot of atheists accuse Christians of doing. But that's not what presuppositionalism is. Presuppositionalism is basically the habit of excavating a person's worldview all the way down to the roots. What are your first axioms, your first principles, right at the bottom of your philosophical tree? What is right at the bottom? What grounds all of it? Basically, and you will find that if you do that at the bottom, there are presuppositions, like things that you have to accept, even though you don't necessarily have evidence for them. And this is true for everyone, even the atheist, right? It is true for absolutely every single person. And presuppositionalism, or the transcendental argument, it basically is basically an excavation to that point, to that root, or should we rather say, not the root, but the seed. What is the seed? And see, right, if you have this seed, will that seed give you the tree that you want, ultimately, right? So if someone is saying, I want a pear tree, but they've actually got an apple seed, you will then, or this is not going to logically give you the tree that you want. And this is where the most powerful, and then after that, natural theology will then come in. So for example, once you've established, so it's almost like hypothesis and then a search for evidence. The search for evidence is meaningless without the hypothesis, because the hypothesis is what primes or conditions what are you looking for, right? So all Christians, no matter how neutral they want to pretend that they're being, right, they would not, if they didn't already believe that God exists, they would have no reason to engage in natural theology in the first place, all right? That's the presupposition. The difference is it reasonable? Is the presupposition reasonable or not? And that's where then the evidence comes in. That's where natural theology comes in. And so when the atheist and the Christian get together and have their little debate, and they're both talking about all of this evidence, they shrug each other off completely, and they basically chase each other's tails, essentially, and they get nowhere, because at no point do they ever discuss first principles, their first axioms, right? Does your worldview give you what it is that you want? So, and now here's the thing, right? Anyone who criticizes presuppositionalism does so completely unaware that they have their own. So for example, I had this actually I've tried this out. I've tried this philosophy out. I've gone out and had the debate with people. Every single one of them. And I actually had this debate with a fellow Seventh-day Adventist, right? Who fully believes in natural theology, but like totally. He doesn't even, the guy doesn't even realize anything, where it even comes from, right? Because it actually came out of, the natural theology comes out of the Western Church, right? After the schism, East and West, you had the Orthodox in the East, and you had the Holy Roman Catholic Empire and Church in the West. Natural theology comes out of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Church, right? Comes out of the Papal Church, and was further solidified by the theologians Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And the reason for that is because they were very, very interested in Aristotelian philosophy, in Hellenistic philosophy, and they basically used those categories and things like that in order to bring all of those. So when the Bible talks about beware of philosophy, right, it's not saying don't avoid philosophy. It's like be careful what kind of philosophical things you accept. And because the Western Roman Church accepted pagan Greek philosophical categories, that's why you find there are a lot of problems in the Western Church. So for example, the idea of absolute divine simplicity, which is a pagan idea, right? The idea of the oneness and the God is in everything and is everything, so that all God's, basically it's the idea that all the energies are the same as God's essence. This is wrong, and this is held by the Western Church, whether they know it or not. Right? And Protestants have inherited that tradition, right? So in the Bible, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I believe this. You can believe it if you want. I'm just putting it out there, right? It's your own information. The Bible, when it writes the letters to the seven churches, as Seventh-day Adventists, we see that not only as a literal, those letters going out to literal churches, but typologically speaking, we see as well that each letter represented a time period in church history, right? And in one of those letters, right, it talks about, we believe that one of those letters represents the time period of the Reformation, and we know that in the structures of the letters it says there's a commendation. It says, I'm glad you're doing X and Y and Z. This is really good. But I have this against you. You're doing something not so great, and you need to repent, and you need to fix this. Now, for the time that we recognize that in one of the letters it says, your works are not yet complete, right? So there was a good work going on, but it's not complete. And we believe that this represents the Reformation period, where they did a lot of good stuff to come away from Rome and its abject apostasy and its heresy and all that kind of stuff, because the Roman Church contradicts not only itself but everything that it mutually established with the worldwide church in the first millennia of church history, right? They contradict many things, right? And now Protestants did well to come away from the Catholic Church, but they did not completely remove themselves from all Catholic thought, right? So even if you look at Protestantism today, much of the errors of Catholic thinking, which is founded in their acceptance of Greek philosophy, is still there. And one of these things is found in what we call natural theology, right? So here's how natural theology works. We look at the world, right? And we come to certain conclusions. So we look at science and all this kind of things. Now, here's what people don't realize when you do that, right? When you do that, you are presupposing human experience, right? You are presupposing the verity of human experience. So basically, natural theology is human sense data centered, right? So we will believe, so we will presuppose logic, things like logic, evidence, rationality, science, right? So we will presuppose, right, all of these categories, right? Logic, evidence, rationality, science, as all of these things form part of our sense data, right? So when I logically reason something, I am assuming that my logic is working correctly. Not only am I assuming that my logic is working correctly, right? I'm presupposing that, but I'm presupposing that logic itself is a thing, right? I'm just presupposing. It's like, oh, there's logic, and almost like logic exists in some sort of a I'm just going to presuppose all these things. Now, here's the problem, right? As a Christian, or if you're looking specifically at the world, you don't really have any reason to believe that any of these things are completely accurate. Sorry, let me just adjust myself here quickly. That's better. Right, so you have no real reason to expect that any of these particular things are necessarily true and reflect something that is, because here's the problem. What a Christian wants is when they, like, for example, when they make a moral claim is a universal claim. So it is always wrong to murder, no matter what, everywhere you go in the world and so on and so forth. Murder is wrong. It's universal and it's unchanging, right? Rape is always wrong, and this is universal and unchanging, for example. Now, here's the thing with logic as well. When you say that you want that logic is true and all these kinds of things, logic as well, it's universal and it's unchanging. But if you're just looking at the universe, starting from the inside out, so what they're doing is they're starting here and reasoning up towards God, right? Starts here, reasoning up towards God, reverse engineering. But now here's the problem. When you say everything that begins has a cause, therefore God is the first cause. So what? The atheist will say. And correct, well, so what? But we don't have to believe it's God. If you're an atheist, and if this is how you reason, you don't necessarily have to believe it's God. This could be anything. Right? And not only that, but if you reason only from this, you have no reason to believe that that any of these categories are universal, right? Why? Because here's a fact of the matter. Human reasoning and evidence and all that kind of stuff is limited, right? We're limited. It's contingent. All observable data is contingent. It's like you can't extrapolate a universal. You can't get an it from an ought from an is, right? You can't make it universal, right? So, for example, if I say to you, there's the old thing. If I say to you, there is a teapot floating around Earth, right? The only way that you could prove conclusively that there is no teapot floating around the Earth is if you observed the Earth from every single direction imaginable, right? From every single direction possible, right? At the same time, right? And then only then could you conclusively prove that there was no teapot floating around, right? And even then you could argue, well, maybe they just missed it, maybe you blinked, right? So our sense data, we need to understand, right? When we're doing reasoning from the universe up, right? Rather than presuppositionalism goes from here, or so God or worldview. Let's call this worldview. Worldview. So for the Christian, worldview contains God. For the atheist, the worldview doesn't contain God, right? And both the natural theologian and the atheist are going from here up and reasoning to either God or no God, right? Both of them are looking at the same universe and coming up with completely different conclusions. Why? So let's have a look at this, right? The Christian, right, essentially what he's doing, right, is looking at the universe and saying, well, you know, we have things like logic, right? We have things like beauty, right? We have beauty. We have things like love. We have things like symbiosis, right? Symbiosis is when animals cooperate with each other. And we've got, oh, look at all these wonderful things, right? So therefore, God must be loving and intelligent and da-da-da-da-da, right? But here's the problem. If you go, the atheist, right, who's looking at the same planet will say, well, hang on a minute, right? If I look at the universe, yes, we agree. We see all of these things, right? Interestingly enough, the atheist is actually being more consistent. Yes, we agree with all of these. The atheist will say, we agree with it. There's this symbiosis, there's all fantastic. And we will agree with the Christian because ultimately, if it wasn't for Christianity, science, all these kinds of things wouldn't. Okay, Christians founded science, but there's a reason for that, right? But the atheist and most people in general will say, but if we look at the universe, right, there's a problem. We also see not only logic, but we see irrationality, right? Irrationality. We don't only see beauty, but we see ugliness. Right? I'm going to add another one here. We see life. Right? The Christian will say we see life. The problem is, if you look at the universe, you've got irrationality, you've got beauty, you've got love, but hang on, we've also got hate. Right? We've got hate as well. We've got not only symbiosis, but we've got parasitism. As well, we've got parasitism, and not only do we have life, but we've also got death. Right? We have the exact opposite of every single one of these. We have this in the world. Now, here's the problem of looking at this and trying to reverse engineer, because the Christian is being biased, right? The atheist is actually being more consistent. Now, when the Christian is challenged with this side of things, right, with whatever's there, the Christian then and the atheist says, well, how do you account for that? If you are reasoning from the world up, right, if it's legitimate for us to believe that God is loving and logical and all these kind of wonderful things by looking at the world, and a Christian asserts that the world is a reflection of God, then please explain to me why these also do not reflect God. So God can also be irrational and ugly and hateful, and indeed that's what they say, right? And warmongering and all these kinds of things. The Christian will say, oh, well, hang on, the reason why these things exist is because there was something called the fall, right? And so the atheist will be like, well, why do you believe that? And the Christian at this point has they they do a little song and dance, but the Christian at the end of the day has to say, we take this on faith. This is our presupposition. We believe this is revealed. Revealed. Ultimately, the Christian relies on revelation. Ultimately. Which is the only reason why when we look at the world, we can say, this is how God originally created it, and the fall resulted in this, right? Because it has been revealed to us by the one who made it. Let me give you an analogy, right? Let's say I go and I build a machine, right? I go and I build this machine. And this shows why you can't really do this. Why natural theology, no matter how good it is secondary to the transcendental arguments. It should be a secondary thing. Natural theology is only useful to demonstrate that the presupposition is reasonable and reflects the real world, okay? So, but we'll get to that, right? So I go and I build a machine. I'm an engineer, okay? I go and I build a machine, and it works in a particular way, and the machine is painted in a particular color, and so on and so forth, right? And we go and put the machine there, okay? Now you want to know something about me, or you want to know who I am. You're going to go, and I actually had this conversation with a gentleman the other day who was like, I believe, if there is a God, I don't believe he cares about us. You know, and he's constantly bringing up evolution this, evolution that. He was agnostic. He wasn't a hard atheist. He's like, it might be, but, and he's like, if there is one, I don't believe he cares about us. And he said, and the reason why he says that is he cites all of these things: evolution, we see parasitism, we see mutation, we see all these kinds of things. And if it doesn't seem, if I go and I look for God here, it doesn't seem like he really cares much, right? Because that's the evidence of the fallen universe. Right? If you presuppose nothing but your sense data and try to reverse engineer. And so what they're doing is they say, listen, Christian, if you want to reverse engineer based on the empirical facts, then so can we, and we see this too. You can't ignore this. And the only reason why the Christian can explain this is because they have revelation, because you will not get the fall from looking at at nature. You won't get it, right? No, you can not go into nature anyway and say there was sometimes at some point a perfect paradise, and there was no sin, and then there was a snake and it fell. You won't get you won't get that from looking at the universe. It won't give you that, okay? And it will not give you the biblical God. And the biblical God is a person. It is not a proposition. And so, anyway, so I'm getting a bit sidetracked. You want to know something about me, so you're going to go and look at you're going to go look at my machine, right? So by looking at the machine, you're going to know one or two things about me. You're going to say, well, A, I'm an engineer. Because obviously if he wasn't an engineer, he wouldn't have been able to design and build a machine, right? Impossible, right? Sort of thing. So he must be an engineer. And then you can extrapolate certain things about me. You know, that he's, so for example, what you get from this is you get only one thing of God. So God is like generic God, natural theology, generic God, is that God is ultimately an engineer or an architect. Is an architect. But here's the problem. Freemasons believe call God the great architect. Right? If your line of argument for God can be used even by a Freemason, you need to know there's something wrong. That's all you can tell, right? So you will tell from looking at my machine that I'm an engineer, and maybe that I like let's say I painted the machine red. Maybe I like the color red. But even then you don't really know, because maybe I colored it red for practical purposes and not necessarily personal preference in terms of color. I might actually prefer green. So it's looking at the machine, there is very, very, very little that you can tell about me at all. Now here's another thing. Let's say I build this machine, I put it there in the workshop, and people are using it. And let's say some real idiot is using the machine and he completely destroys the machine, right? And no one knows about this, right? And this guy, you know, in order to fix the machine, he does jippos and he modifies it, but he basically makes a total mess of it, right? So now someone comes and wants to know something about me, and he's going to ask, and you say, well, I'm going to look at this machine, right? What do I get if I look at this machine in this particular condition, right? The machine is a total disaster. What are they going to think? They're going to think, naturally, if they're just reasoning from the machine, they're going to think the engineer is incompetent. He designed a piece of junk, because they have no way of knowing that all the subsequent modifications and stuff, they have no way of knowing whether that was me that did it or whether it came later, which is the exact same thing you have here with this. So the atheist is looking at this complete mess, right? All this irrationality and ugliness and death and decay, and saying, well, then God can't. And they do say that, right? You look at Richard Dawkins and they're like, listen, if there is a God, then he's a bit of an idiot, because come on, death and suffering and mutation. What the hell kind of God is this? Okay. So that's the problem when you reason from inside out rather than from revelation down. And this is why Christians in the beginning, and here's the thing, a lot of Protestants say, oh, we believe in revelation. But when you're reasoning like this, you're not practicing, you're not going with a revealed doctrine. And it's because of this that so many Christians in the West are accepting things like evolution. There's no other reason. They're accepting things like evolution. They're accepting things like all gods. They're accepting a whole bunch of garbage because they're taking scientific discovery or sense data as the primary. That's their presupposition. That is their first principle, and they're reverse engineering from that to try and get a God, rather than look at the Bible and see what does God say about himself. And that's the thing. If people go and look at my machine, there's only one way they can know anything about me, and that's if they come to me personally and ask me, Morgan, what are you like? Reveal yourself to me. So even, let's say you go and think about any of your friends. You would know nothing about them, right? If they didn't reveal themselves to you, if they didn't tell you, I'm like this, I'm like that, I'm like that, and the next thing, right? You wouldn't know. There's certain things about me you cannot know unless I tell you about them, unless I reveal it to you, because you have no access to my mind. You're not telepathic and psychic and all that kind of stuff. Now, here's the thing. I could lie. I could lie. So, for example, you could, so, well, what if God lied? Might be. That's when then natural theology comes in, all right? They all say, well, what if God lied to you and his revelation is false? Okay? Then only then does natural theology come in, right? Because you're taking what God said, and the Bible says this. I tell you this, for example, with prophecy. God says, I give you this prophecy, I tell you beforehand, and the reason I do this is so that when these things happen, as I've said they will happen, you will then know that I'm God and that I have the power of foresight, right? And this is it. So now natural theology goes out to find, does this match up? Does the worldview give me and match up to the world that exists out there, right? So that is the proper place. It comes afterwards, because revelation first, and then natural theology, because your evidence makes no sense if you don't know where it's like a scientific hypothesis, right? You first develop the hypothesis, right? In science, you sort of have an observation, and then you form a thesis, and then you go and you test out and make it sure. Whereas in this is a little bit different, that you, rather than observation, you have hypothesis, observation, confirmation, and so on and so forth, right? So it starts off with the hypothesis, with the revelation, and this individual, God is an individual, is a person, and that's it. It's not a proposition. It's not like it's not the type of thing like, is there a bottle of water on the table in the lounge? Oh, let me go and look. That's not how it works, right? And if you are looking, and to look at the earth, at the universe, at the natural world, to try and understand who God is as nonsensical, right, as looking at my machine or anything that I make and trying to understand who I am, right? It's nonsensical. You might get inklings, right? You might get, so I obviously like engineering, so otherwise I wouldn't be in engineering, so there are certain inferences you can make, but the inferences can ultimately go anywhere and everywhere depending on what your suppositions are, which is why so many Christians have a completely unbiblical view of God, because they're going from here to God rather than from God down. And they have a wrong view of the world as well. So they think this. Now, here's the interesting thing. What a lot of people don't realize about natural theology is that you've got logic, so you've got all the beautiful stuff and you've got the bad stuff. So this is how yin-yang was invented. Now you know how these pagan theories came about. The circle of life idea, the whole... Because if you go with natural theology, this is the worldview that you're going to get. This explains why all paganism ultimately ends up with this worldview. Right? End of story. Right? So even... So, and we know this. As soon as you see this, you know, because they're taking into account... This is why all of the, like the Buddhists, the Hindus, all these, they all have this yin yang concept where there's good and bad. There's this balance between good and evil. They're in constant dialectical tension with each other. They need a little bit of balance in each other, night and dark, so on and so forth. And from there stem all of these kinds of philosophies. And when you look at the Christian teaching specifically says that the reason why all of the pagan religions come about is because they're ignoring divine revelation, and they are reasoning for themselves based on what they see in the world, in the universe. And there is no, if you are taking this alone in its own right, the universe in its own right, there is you cannot get anything other than this kind of a worldview. You will not get the Christian God from natural theology, right? Impossible, absolutely possible. And here's the thing, right? To go a little bit more in depth about natural theology, if you look at logic, evidence, and so on and so forth, right? Here's what people don't realize when they're doing natural theology. They use logic to get evidence, okay? They use logic to get evidence. But here's the thing, right? With transcendental arguments, logic itself is the evidence for God's existence. Right? You need to think about that very clearly. Logic itself is evidence for God's existence. The fact that we have logic at all, the fact that we can do mathematics, all of these things that are used to dig up evidence are themselves evidence. The fact that such a thing as truth exists is evidence for God. Right? In the transcendental argument. Because now here's the thing. What is the nature of logic? And so, for example, you talk about, let's start with logic, right? Logic is universal. It's not, first of all, it's not invented. It's not rooted in the human mind. And we know this because logic, the laws of logic are discovered. They're not invented. They are discovered. All right. When we're trying to apply it out in the new world, same thing with the laws of nature. The laws of nature are not invented; they are discovered. When we go and observe, they are discovered. So they are not anchored. They are independent of the human mind. Right. Now here's the thing: logic is independent of the human mind. First of all, so it's not invented; it's discovered. It is universal because it applies everywhere, all the time. Okay. And, like, for example, the law of non-contradiction. Let's take the law of non-contradiction. So, for example, you can't say that this pen exists and doesn't exist at the same time. It's logically impossible. It either exists or it does not. You cannot say it both does and does not exist at the same time. Unless you want to be relativistic and idiotic, right? You can't do that. So, even the universe, right? If the universe didn't exist, logic would still dictate and say the universe doesn't exist. So it doesn't even exist. So logic is not even anchored or founded in this universe, right? Because if the universe didn't exist, it would be true logically that it doesn't exist. And it would be false logically that to say that the universe existed if it doesn't. So it doesn't even exist in this material universe. So logic is, right, is discovered. So we know it's not anchored in the human mind. We know it's also not anchored in nature because it is universal, right? and independent and true, even if the universe natural, even if the natural world did not exist. And furthermore, it is unchanging. It is unchanging, right? And what do we know about the universe? And every atheist knows this. The atheist and the Gnostic and the pagan all have something in common. They all say that the universe is constantly in flux. It's constantly in flux. It's changing. This is where evolution comes from. It's this idea, when you look out, the universe is constantly in flux. It's constantly changing. There's no reason why the universe, if you take the atheist, agnostic, whatever way of thinking it is, there is no reason why the universe should be the way it is. It's just a happy accident, right? And there's no reason why we should expect the universe to continue being as it is tomorrow. It might change. And if the laws of logic and everything like that were based in nature, then they should change and evolve the same along with nature, right? But because mathematics, logic, truth do not change, we then know it is not anchored in nature, right? Nature follows them, so we know that there is something. Now, here's what happened, right? Plato and all of these guys postulated was what they called a Platonic realm. Like there was some sort of ethereal space where these immaterial entities existed somewhere. Logic, all these kinds of things, logic, rationality, truth, are Platonic, or these are objects in their own right, existing in some plane somewhere, right? Well, now for the atheist and so on and so forth, this might be satisfactory, right? Because here's the interesting, even pagans believe that, okay? Because the gods themselves are subject. The gods themselves, first of all, are material. All of the gods are material. The gods in paganism, the gods are nothing more than personified versions of natural occurrences, right? And what do you get that from doing? You get that by doing natural theology. That's where you get the goddess of love, the goddess of truth, the goddess of logic, the god of war, all of these kinds of things, right? And they're all natural phenomena, right? Only the Christian deity, the Christian God, transcends, is outside nature, right? A lot of atheists think that the whole evolution idea is original. It's not. Evolution has existed in all pagan religions since the beginning of time, since the beginning of whenever. They've always believed in evolution, right? So if you look at Greek mythology, for example, you first had the primordials. The primordials were whatever they were. There was a big war in the celestial, infinite cosmos, and these things, there's no beginning and no end. And they had a war. They eliminated each other, and from the fragments of this massive battle, the Titans emerged, right? Out of this chaotic war of the primordial elements with each other, the primordials, whatever that was, space, time, so on and so forth. And from that emerged the Titans. Right, so you had, for example, Kronos, you had Atlas, you had so on and so forth. The Titan of the Earth, I forget her name. The Mother Nature of the Titan. Can you believe it? I completely forgot. Right, so you've got all these Titans, but then the Titans gave birth to the gods, and there was a war between the gods and the Titans. Right, and then humans came out of the gods. And so on and so forth. So it's all an evolutionary, it's an evolutionary process as well, right? And all of it is a metaphor, is a metaphor for the natural theology that the Greeks were doing, essentially, and that's how they came up with it. And now Protestants and Western Christians, so Catholics and Protestants, make this mistake, and to a large degree, more and more, so are the Orthodox, right? Because the Orthodox didn't necessarily do this, but they are now in a lot of ways. They're doing this natural theology, and a lot of even Orthodox people are accepting things like evolution and so on and so forth. And we know the Catholic Church has capitulated to evolution. Protestants have capitulated, evangelicals have capitulated, all to evolution, and all this naturalistic, natural theology kind of reasoning from here up to God which is why people come. It's why a homosexual person can say, well, God is obviously okay with homosexuality because it exists in this universe, right? Therefore it's okay, right? So there's no way, if you are reasoning from the earth upwards, that's precisely what you're going to get. So now, what is so we've got all that, right? So let's make some space. So what is presuppositionalism? All right, presuppositionalism or transcendental. I'm just going to call it presup, right? Presup. So it's basically whatever you're doing before you say sup, right? Bad joke. Bear with me. Right? Or transcendental. Transcendental arguments. What is this? What it does is it says, whatever your worldview is, right? Whatever you believe it to be, whether you believe the Christian God through revelation, or Buddhism, or whatever it is, right? Whatever it is, what does it say about the universe? Right? So in here you have everything. You have everything from Christianity. Actually, I'm just going to make the symbol. Right? You have everything from Christianity to atheism. Right? All of it. What does your worldview say about the universe? Okay? What does it say about the universe? And so what does it say about the nature of the universe? And what does it want? What does it want? Okay? Out of that universe, right? So, for example, over here, you would say, so a Christian wants, so it says the universe was constructed by God, etc., etc., and it wants morality, for example, it wants truth, it wants all these kinds of things, right? And atheism, for the most part, will do the same. It has a different view of it. It says the universe was not, it's just an accident and all that kind of stuff. But atheists also, generally speaking, want things like morality and truth and ethics and all these kinds of things. But now presuppositionalism and transcendentalism, and also what does it want and what does it affirm to be true, right? So both of them will affirm things like logic, will affirm things like morality, etc., etc. I'm talking about, broadly speaking, there are Christians who are stupid enough to believe that morality can just be thrown away, so they throw away the Ten Commandments. There are atheists who do say, they're quite frank, well, I don't believe there is such a thing as morality. So putting all those subtleties aside, we're looking at overall worldviews here. So what does it affirm? And what it affirms is also, in a lot of ways, what it wants. So truth, kindness, etc., etc. And ultimately, what presuppositionalism does is it takes that and it says, does it give you what you want? Does this, combined with that, give you that? And right? This universe that you're describing, what do you want out of this universe? Does this universe actually give you these things, right? Okay? In the first place, does it actually give you these things? And do these things here, what does this universe give you? Does it actually reflect the universe we're actually looking at? Right? Is it actually there? So, for example, remember earlier on I was saying laws of logic, right? Let's take logic. In this unit, we want, so here we can affirm, let's say, let me use another color. Put that away. So let's say over here we want logic. Okay? And logic underpins, man, logic underpins absolutely everything. You can't have language is constructed in very logical ways and stuff like that. Sentences have structures so we can understand each other. It's not chaotic. It follows patterns and things like that, right? Mathematics, all kinds of things, right? So we want to affirm, this is what we want, and we affirm. Everyone here wants to affirm that, right? Interestingly enough, Buddhists don't necessarily, they come up with things called Zen cones or something like that, which are, they say it's extra logical, it's idiotic, and atheists love throwing this stupidity around. I don't know what it is, right? But atheists, the atheists today just love Buddhism. I don't know what it is with them. It's like they have no idea what it's about, but you know, it's in vogue these days, right? Everything, or now all of a sudden everything from the, well, not all of a sudden, since the 60s, you know, everything from the East is wonderful, right? So anyway, so we want logic, okay? Both of them want logic. This is what we want. Does the universe that you posit give you what you want, right? Ultimately, will it give you logic? And is logic reflected in the universe? Is it actually there, right? Now, logic, as we discussed earlier on, because it's universal, it is unchanging, etc., etc., right? We cannot say that this exists in the universe. Okay? So logic is not anchored in the universe, right? So for the atheist, the universe is only material. So when we go and we say, and we look at the universe, right? Here's what we affirm. The atheist affirms logic, right? Its worldview says that it's only material, that the whole universe is material. But when we look at the universe, if it's only natural, it does not give you logic. Because logic transcends time and space, is unchanging, it's universal, etc., etc., and would be true even if the natural world didn't exist. We know that then something more has to exist. The atheistic universe does not, when you look at it to see if it reflects logic, which they affirm exists, it does not give you. The universe doesn't reflect. A naturalistic universe should not reflect logic at all. There should be no logic out there, right? Logic should change. Even so, for example, even something like evolution that they believe in. Why does evolution itself not evolve? Right? Why is evolution so consistent? Right? If you take Darwinism seriously, why is evolution itself so constant and unchanging throughout all the aeons? Right? There's no reason why evolution cannot evolve to be something different, to be something else, right? To evolve to not be true, right? There's no reason for that, which is why then some people, as Christians and stuff like that, are saying, oh, well, they will accept evolution because they're doing natural theology, but because they want to hang on to their Christian roots, They will say, well, evolution is logical and unchanging, because it is anchored in the mind of God, right? But then they do that by completely ignoring revelation, by saying, well, what God said is not really true. I'm going to take my sense data, which I presuppose, aside from God's revelation, my sense data, and I'm going to reason in such a way that'll even contradict the revealed truth that God gives me. And there's the problem. And Freemasons do this. Many Christians do this. So that's why there's utter apostasy in Christian churches. Because a lot of atheists will complain that the abject stupidity that's going on in the Christian church has something to do with what's taught in the Bible. It's not. The absurdities that are happening in the Christian church are not happening because the people believe what's in the Bible. It's happening because the people believe, because the people are rationalizing. In spite of what the Bible says, they are rationalizing based on their presupposition, that is their acceptance of their sense data. They are rationalizing in opposition to what the Bible teaches. In almost every way imaginable. And they come up with all kinds of nonsense. Like, for example, something that is very common within Protestantism and even the evangelical community as well, is this idea that when you die, the soul flutters off, and this idea that your body and your soul are intrinsically connected to such a degree that when Jesus Christ rose, he rose bodily, right? They completely ignore that. Then you go off and you sit as a spirit on Abraham's lap in heaven somewhere, right? They've completely spiritual, and you see this trend happening more and more often within Protestantism and evangelicalism, where they're spiritualizing everything is becoming metaphorized and spiritualized away, so that there's nothing concrete about it. But then the atheist will then rebel against that and will say, hang on, you're not dealing with the real world. And that's precisely it. There's this false dialectic between the spiritual and the physical that has come within Christianity, and that is because of this natural theology, as well as a whole bunch of other Hellenistic categories and stuff that's completely infected and sent Christian thought completely screwy, completely and utterly screwy, right? Because in order to rationalize one thing, they have to come up with something which then might contradict something else, and in order to try and salvage that, they have to think up somewhere, and they just contradict themselves left, right, and center, rather than simply going in the simple true faith that is revealed in the Bible. And so this presuppositional apologetics, for example, and how can you say, natural theology and all these kinds of things, this is how they should work. You first have your presupposition. Your natural theology will give you, what do we want to affirm and what do we want? So your natural theology can go out there and see, yeah, what we presuppose, right, what has been revealed to us actually does reflect the universe that the presupposition, that the revelation gives us, right? So when we look at the world and we see there's beauty but and ugliness, we can say, yeah, okay, this is how in the universe we affirm that there is beauty and ugliness, right? So the universe reflects what we affirm, right? Now, what do we make of it and all that? Why, even though there is beauty and ugly, why should we reject the ugly rather than accept it as a natural thing? Is because the universe is not merely natural, right? But it was created by something that transcended it, that had a telos attached. When God created, he did not intend for X, Y, and Z to happen. That came in later, and therefore, just because it's there doesn't mean that that is what God intended. And just because it's there is not a reflection. So if we go back to my machine analogy, just because someone has come later and modified my machine does not mean that I intended the machine to work that way. You understand what I'm saying? And you can only know how I intended it to work if you come to me and ask me why and how I originally designed it and why I designed it that way. Okay, and so this is where essentially the beef is with Christians and atheists. It's here. It's not at the level of the. It's not here, right? And it's not there, right? Does it reflect and all this kinds of stuff? It's here. It's at the level of the worldview. It's here and here. It's the presupposition, what the presupposition tells you about the universe that you live in, and then all the reasoning comes in afterwards, right? And that is why you get all of these debates. They're actually painful to watch. I watched one with John Lennox and he's a chemist, man. He's an arrogant son of a gun. My goodness, I forget his name. Peter Atkins. My goodness, that guy is just he's unbelievable. You got to watch him. And it was so painful to watch because they're just spinning their wheels. Peter, completely ignorant of what his presuppositions are. Totally, and obviously he would be, because all the atheists, right, your major thinkers, Richard Dawkins, to a lesser degree, but like Hawking, for example, Stephen Hawking, Peter Atkins, and all these guys, they say philosophy is dead, without realizing that the idea that philosophy is dead is itself a philosophy. Therefore, according to the law of non-contradiction, they contradict themselves, because you cannot dismiss philosophy by using philosophy in order to dismiss it. Okay, and obviously, because they're ignorant of philosophy, because they reject philosophy, they do not realize that they have presuppositions which presuppose what kind of a universe we live in, and that presupposition of that universe is then going to prime what you will and will not allow. So when we talk about like for example, we talk about evidence, right? Let's talk about when we talk about evidence. Let's talk about evidence, right? So when you are talking to to an atheist or whatever the case, they'll always be, oh, show me the evidence, man. Give me the evidence, man. My peer review papers, man. Right? Every time. My peer review papers. every time, okay? And I don't blame them, because a lot of Christians, they completely abandon logic and reason as if it's some kind of sinful thing, right? Because of this idea of complete and utter depravity, they don't trust their logic and reason, and they become irrational. And the atheist reaction is actually a knee-jerk reaction to Christian stupidity and irrationality that descends from these strange doctrines. So anyway, when you're talking about evidence, when the atheist asks for evidence, here's the thing, right? How do you get evidence? Right? Let's put that there. How do you get evidence? You cannot get evidence if you don't first have logic. Right? You cannot have evidence if you don't have truth. If you don't believe in truth. Evidence is irrelevant if you don't believe in logic and truth, right? Because you cannot even begin the exercise of collecting evidence if you don't believe in the logic behind collecting evidence. You can't even do science, right? Science without evidence is dead, okay? You can't do it. You can't do science, because science is all about observation, and so, for example, and you can't have evidence, right? You can't do science, you can't do observation if you don't believe in identity, ID, over time. Identity over time, right? Because if the atheist is right and everything is material and all material things are in flux, then you cannot account for identity over time, because everything should be constantly changing. You cannot tell me that the evidence you're looking at now is the same evidence that you were looking at an hour ago. You simply have to assume as an atheist that is the case, but your own worldview does not grant you the right to believe that as an atheist, right? You might want to believe it. That's no one is disputing what you want to affirm. We know you want to affirm that. We know that atheists want to be moral. Their worldview is all about saying, well, you know, we don't like the atheist criticism of religion is a moral one. Is based on morality. Is based on truth. We believe they're false. We believe they're wrong. And we have a different truth. Yeah, and they do evil things, right? If everything is material and everything is flux, there's no reason why morality can't change, which is why precisely in atheism it does. Okay, morality can be whatever you want it to be. 100 years ago, homosexuality was wrong. Nowadays, a man is allowed to be a woman. A man is allowed to be a donkey, a cat, if he wanted to be, right? Do whatever. And now the atheists, now here's the problem. The atheists want to affirm logic, okay, logic. But now because it's become so absurd, right? This whole thing, now a man can be a woman, and they assume, you know, they assume identity over time. They assume truth, they assume logic, all of these kinds of things. But the transgender person who is an atheist is actually being more consistent than the atheist is when they say, well, if everything is in flux, if everything changes and whatever, if evolution is true, there's no reason to say why a man can't now be a woman. If everything changes, why not? Okay? And because their worldview doesn't give you truth and logic and all these kinds of things, then I can just make up my own logic if I want to. There's no reason for that, because if you look into nature, if you look in nature, you will see that logic is there, but you will also at the same time find that logic is not anchored in nature. Logic transcends nature, which is why it is invariant, unchanging, and same thing with truth and identity over time. For example, if you think about yourself, right? You're sitting here watching this video, right? Now here's something you need to understand. Every 7 odd years, every single atom in your body is replaced. Every single molecule, every single atom in your body is replaced. If your identity, therefore, was located in your physical being, that means you are not the same person. You are an imposter. You are not you. Right? If you are purely material, and every single part of your material being gets replaced every 7 years, then you are not the same person that you were 7 years ago. You're an imposter. You're someone else. You're merely a clone with the previous person's name. That's all you are, right? Pure materialism does not give you identity over time. And the fact, and here's the thing, and this is why in the transcendental argument for God, we believe because all these things are anchored in God, which sits outside time and space. God is unchanging, immaterial, etc., etc. That is why we can affirm these things as unchanging, immaterial, consistent over time, and not subject to the flux in nature. And that's why the Christian can affirm such things, and it's why the Christian can believe in things like identity over time. Because the Christian, whilst we believe that your body is part of your identity, we do not affirm the idea that you are only material. You couldn't possibly be only material, because if you were only material, your identity could not persist over time, over 10 years, let alone 50 or 60 or 70 years. Absolutely impossible. It wouldn't do that. So ultimately, that's what presuppositionalism is. You're getting to the bottom of the first principles. You're saying, what do you believe the world to be? Before you even collect evidence, right? Because you can't start collecting evidence if you don't first believe these things. Truth, identity, you can't do it, right? Evidence comes after these things, right? You have to even the scientists, science and evidence. It's like, what if the scientist lies? All right, science collapses if you don't tell the truth, right? Which we know, because the recent reproducibility crisis has caused an absolute uproar in the entire scientific community, where scientists left, right, and center, because of various pressures. We're not saying it's purely for unscrupulous reasons and stuff like that, right? But it's irony. It's a beautiful irony. But they're complaining because there's all these scientists that are lying, right? So science cannot be done if you don't tell the truth, and therefore science has to presuppose truth before science can even be done. You can't do science unless you presuppose truth, unless you presuppose logic and all these kinds of things. And so those are your presuppositions. And now if you presuppose logic, truth, and all these kinds of things, you then have to justify your reason for using them. Do they just exist just out there on their own? And we know that these entities, and again, this is where it comes in. The Christian believes in God. Why? Because logic, truth, and all mathematics, even though we believe that these are abstract entities, right? For the Christian, they are anchored in the mind of God. Why? Because logic and truth and all these things have no causal, they cannot cause anything to happen. Only a person can cause things to happen. Right? So if anything is happening at all, we know it's not logic that's making it happen. It's not truth that is making it happen. Right? Because like the number one doesn't make anything happen. We know that the number one exists. If we're being agnostic about it, it exists out there somewhere. The number one, and 1 + 1 is 2. But 1 + 1, if just by 1 + 1 itself, numbers have no causal relationship to the material world. Mathematics don't make things happen. Things happen on their own and whatever, so things are being caused. But what causes them? It can't be these things, because we know they have no causal relationship. There's nothing there. And what do we know is the one thing in the universe that can cause things to happen is a mind and a person, which is why for Christians, God isn't just some being, some force, some whatever kind of thing. God is a person, is an individual who has will and who can make things happen by virtue of that will, who can interfere and interject into the events and make things happen in the same way that human beings do, right? And then, and only then, right, once we've got that, we can then say, right, now that we've got logic and truth and all these kinds of things, only then can we say, right, let's use evidence and sense data. Now that we have God, who is an unchanging anchor for all truth, for all reason, for all logic, for all of these kinds of things, that grants me identity over time, that grants me a universe that will abide by laws, because laws again come from mind and everything. Because we have all of those things, only then can we say, right, we are now going to go and collect evidence to support whether this is true or not. But the thing is, right, logic and truth themselves are evidence for God. Right? You're using the very thing that is evidence for God to collect evidence for God. Right? The natural theology, whilst interesting and good, is a second order philosophical pursuit that comes only after divine revelation. Only after divine revelation, because you cannot, just like you cannot get to me through my machine, you cannot get to God through the material world. Impossible. Which is why the Christian believes in revelation, that God came to us and said, here I am. This is who I am. And revealed himself to mankind. Right? In the same way that for a person to know who I am, I have to go and introduce myself. There's no other way. I have to go and introduce myself. The person can do as much scientific experiments as they want to infer my existence, but unless I actually show myself to them, if they never see me, they will never have good reason to know that I exist. Never. And they will never know who I am. Because they will never know if they're inferring from all kinds of things happening in the world that maybe Morgan exists. They ultimately don't have, because they don't know who I am, they do not know which one of those things that they're observing were caused by me or by someone else. So I have to reveal who I am. And once I've revealed who I am, they will then, by doing the evidence and doing all the research based on what I've revealed, they will then be able to go out into the world and know whether I'm lying or telling the truth. And so that's why I say presupposition, the transcendental arguments, the revelation comes first. That's what Christians believe. Transcendental revelation comes first. The evidence and the natural theology comes second. And you're going to get nowhere with an atheist if you're arguing about evidence this and evidence that and evidence the next thing. Because, like, even if we talk about for example, like one of the arguments that's become very popular these days is the evidence for the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The evidence is powerful. The evidence is this and this and so on and so forth, which is great. You know, I'm not denying any of those things and all that kind of stuff. But literally, the only reason why you believe now here's the thing, even the atheist agrees and the skeptic agrees that there was someone called Jesus, that he was crucified, etc., that he was buried, and that his body was found missing. What they call the sort of the minimal facts argument. Right? The atheist, the skeptic, can accept all of the minimal. There is no reason why an atheist cannot accept the minimal facts, none whatsoever. And many of them do. They say, "Yeah, we'll grant you that," you know, sort of thing. But the reason why we believe that evidence means that Christ was resurrected. The only reason why we believe that is because we believe in resurrection, because prophecy told us that this was going to be the case. Right? Because for the apostles it was one thing. They got to see Jesus. I don't get to see Jesus in that same way. I didn't see him resurrect. I have to take it on faith, not only the testimony of all the Christians that have come before me, including the ones that actually did see the event themselves. The only reason I have to believe that what they said was true, the only reason I have to believe that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, is because I have revelation and prophecy that preceded the coming of Christ to tell me this is what I should expect. Right? And so for the atheist, in his worldview, everything is only materialistic, even though he can agree with the minimal facts. Because his materialism says dead people don't rise from the dead, therefore then it didn't happen. That's his worldview constricts him into that thing. It's only by arguing the worldview, hang on, your ultimate worldview does not work. And only once you've accepted the worldview in which God exists, only if God exists can dead people rise. Only if God exists. No evidence can convince, no material thing can convince you as proof, definitive proof, that unless you saw it happen in front of you. But even then you could be skeptical, because then you could say, well, maybe he wasn't really dead. Maybe he was just dormant in some way. People for the most part, right? And a lot of this comes from this whole I effing love science movement stupidity. The vast majority of people have no idea how difficult it is to prove something true. It is exceptionally difficult. The concept of proof as definitive, conclusive proof is appropriate to mathematics and logic only, and that's it. That's the only place where you're ever going to get proof done. That's the only place is in mathematics, and everything else, it can be argued. Why? Because human sense data, human experience is contingent. It is limited. It is finite. We do not know all things at all times. And the only time a human can do that is either be definite, is, as in this is absolutely proven 100%, is at the point that that particular human being knows everything about everything, or receives the revelation of the truth from someone who is omniscient and knows all things. But because we know we are not omniscient and we're finite, therefore, for the Christian, absolutes have to come from someone who is himself absolute. And that's where the Christian ethic comes from. If you don't have that, if you can't agree on the worldview, and I'm not saying the evidence won't, by all means, I'm not saying people shouldn't do apologetics. I'm not saying they shouldn't do the minimal facts arguments, etc., etc., etc. But they need to realize, so that we don't go out there and chase our tails and spin our wheels and all that kind of stuff, is get down when you're dealing with someone, whether it's an atheist, no matter who it is, get down to the roots of to the kernel, to the seed of what it is you believe. Say, listen, this is what you have, this is what you want. Does your worldview give you not only what you want, but what you affirm to be true? Does your worldview allow that? Do they mesh? And only then, when you agree on the worldview, well, then all of the evidence that can be given, all of the arguments and will they be like, yeah, you know what, it is actually, now that I agree with the worldview, now do I see, yeah, the evidence actually does, it's all coherent in one package. It all has to come. You can't divorce the evidence from the worldview, from all that kind of stuff, because it is your worldview that orients you and aims you. It's like writing a computer program, like writing a computer simulation. What the computer simulation spits out at the end, is determined by what you plug in the first place. And it's the same thing with all the reasoning, all of the human logic and human rationality and human reasoning, right? These are all like computer programs, algorithms that run to give us a conclusion. But if what you plug in is faulty, then what you get out on the other side, though logical, might not necessarily be true. So we need to think very carefully about these things. And ladies and gentlemen, to finish, that is why I was wrong about natural theology, because once upon a time I used to believe, because I descend because I am a Westerner, even though I'm Brazilian I'm Brazilian. Brazil is a Western country. My father is part Portuguese. Portugal is a Western country. I grew up in South Africa. It's a third world, but it was colonized by Westerners, by Western thinking. That Western thinking pervades, and was all conditioned by the Roman Church. And for a long time I thought I can do like the atheist does, and logically and reason my way to Christ and to God and all these kind. You can't do it. The presupposition is what comes first, right? Not that it isn't effective, because in a lot of ways I was converted because these arguments were so powerful, but also because I realized that these arguments made the revealed, right? And here's the crux: because the evidence demonstrated that what was revealed was not silly, that it might actually be true. It gave credence to what was revealed. But until I went and looked at what was revealed, all of the evidence in the world would never take me to the Christian God as he is revealed in the Bible. Wouldn't do it. It would only be like, all right, it will only gives me a legitimate reason to go and look at the Bible in the first place. Anyway, so I was wrong about that, about the order of things. I dismissed, for a long time, presuppositional apologetics, transcendental, all this. I thought it was totally idiotic. And I was wrong. Very, very wrong. And it's amazing, it's my lost thing. Let me tell you a story. That'll illustrate the point, right? I heard this little story from someone at some point. Here's the story. A man leaves home running, right? He runs a little way and turns left. He runs for a little way and then turns left. And he runs a little way again and turns left. And this final left that he takes him back home. When he got home, he saw two men with masks waiting for him. Right? At home. Now here's the question. Okay? Why did the man start running? And who were the two masked men? Now, depending on what your presupposition is, you're going to get wildly different answers. So most people presuppose that the word home means his house, and if his home means his house, they're going to presume that the guy is a bit of a fitness freak and that he started running because he is a jogger, right? And if that's the case, they're going to presume that the two masked men are thieves waiting for him to come home so that they can sort him out and hijack him. Okay? But if you take home to mean, if you presuppose that home means a baseball pitch, then immediately it completely changes how you look at it. Then home is where the pitcher, the pitcher and the catcher, not the pitcher and the catcher and the umpire are. The two masked men are the catcher and the umpire. Home is the base, and he took off running because he hit a home run, which is why he went and turned left, went and turned left in a diamond shape, and then eventually came home. Depends on what you presuppose, and what you believe is the case in the beginning of that story is going to prime what you believe the story is about. It's going to prime, it's going to aim you to where you're going, right? And I love that story because it so beautifully illustrates the point. And most of us have no idea that the conclusions that we draw, we think they're very rational, we think they're very evidence-based and all that kind of stuff. But most of us, when we believe something, when we think that we have good reason to believe something, the vast majority of us do not realize that the only reason why we got there in the first place is because our first principles, our presuppositions, primed us to take that road in the first place. And what we should actually be asking is, before we take any road, is what do I see? Where do I want to end up? And will this road actually, one of these roads, Christianity, atheism, Buddhism, whatever it is, will they actually take me to where I'm going? And will they actually be in line with what I actually see? Can they even allow me to trust what I see? Because Buddhism says everything is an illusion. You can't trust what you see, for example. So immediately that disqualifies you. Well, you can't trust anything you see. It's all an illusion, right? The divisions and categories of things are all a deception. Well, if everything is an illusion, then so is the assertion that everything is an illusion. Therefore, you're dead in the water from the get-go. You can't do it. Right? Which one of these allows the train to take off in the first place? Right? That's how we need to look at these things. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my 2 cents on this matter. I hope this helps. I really, really do, because it took me a while, man. It took me a long while, but yeah, anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, God bless you. I hope you all had a fantastic Easter weekend. And yeah, God bless. Take it easy. And until next time, cheerio.